Hi everyone. I just got done watching another movie on Netflix. This one was called The Invitation. And out of all the actors in the film, it stars Logan Marshall-Greene. And if any of you are not sure who that is, he was Charlie in Prometheus. Uh, and in this film, he plays the central protagonist. I thought overall the movie was quite good. So I'll say that right off the bat. I enjoyed it quite a bit. It was an independent film. It wasn't what I would call a slasher movie. It was a slow burn, slow boil thriller that's mainly psychological up until about the very end. For the last 20 minutes or so, things take a turn for the worse, or rather, they switch gears. And I really enjoyed this movie because it takes its time making you wonder how things are going to turn out. And in the grand tradition of Alfred Hitchcock, wherein he says it's not the bomb that's going off that's scary, it's waiting for the bomb to go off. That's where the tension comes from. And this film is a movie that really understands that. And that it constantly presents things that make you think that there might be something wrong, but you're not sure because it also provides other things that sort of temporarily diffuse or alleviate the tension, but not eradicate it entirely, so that you're left with a sense of lingering doubt. And this gradually builds throughout the film, wherein you start to doubt the protagonist to an extent, but at the same time, you can never fully discredit him either. And it's a lot of fun because the movie takes about 80% of its screen time doing this, which is great because the problem with a lot of movies that attempt this formula is that as soon as you burst the bubble, that's it. You've essentially um, fired your shot, and then after that, it's sort of up to the movie to sort of finish things quickly or move on to something else. But if the focus of the film is essentially the shot that's being fired, then you want to have good build-up. Um, you don't want to fire your shot too soon, essentially, because then you're going to be left with a lot of screen time where you're just essentially um, uh, you're left with the option of being stuck in a movie where the most exciting thing has already happened. And in this case, it goes up until about the very end of the film. The last act is about 20 minutes, I suppose. And up until that point, it's constant build-up. And it's very well done. It's done in flashback. It's done uh, mainly through the perspective of our hero, whose name in the movie I can't remember. I'll call him Charlie because he's basically Charlie from Prometheus. Again, he's played by Logan Marshall-Greene, and he is at a dinner party. The plot of the film essentially is that he is at a dinner party. He's been invited to attend with his new girlfriend, or his current girlfriend. I'm not sure how new they are. The movie never establishes that. But the movie starts with them driving towards this dinner party, and they are talking back and forth, and they are essentially wondering what's going on, what's going to happen when they get there. And they arrive, and there are other people there as well. Essentially, all of the people know each other, and they're all connected by this singular event, which later you find out is a tragedy. Um, Logan Marshall-Greene's character's son uh, died during the film. The character's son, and they are essentially reuniting after several years to sort of attempt to bond or reestablish bonds after this tragedy. And it's not something the film reveals right away. I'm explaining it now for you in a single sentence, essentially, to sort of give you uh, the gist of the story, but the movie takes its time and it slowly builds and it reveals things about these characters at this party. And it kind of felt um, like a game of Clue where nobody dies um, at first, because there are all of these different characters and they're each presented in a constructive, structured way where here is this character, the movie focuses on them, and you're given certain details about them that either make you trust them or mistrust them. And there's a pretty large, it's a pretty large party. I mean, for a film that attempts this sort of exercise, it's a fairly large group. I'd say it's about maybe 10 people tops. But when you have to devote a certain amount of screen time to each character to sort of establish who they are and what their motives are, and the movie has its plate full, but it does a good job with this, and it moves from character to character, and we learn a little bit about each as the movie goes along. And it does a really wonderful job sort of providing us with this cast of different characters and who, as the movie progresses, our opinion of them changes as we learn more about them and why Logan Marshall-Greene's character is there with his girlfriend. And it's interesting because, for instance, it will present things in such a way so that you're not always sure what you're seeing. Not to the point that it becomes downright confusing, but for instance, when the two guests arrive at the party and are essentially escorted inside the premises, Logan Marshall-Greene's character looks through a window and he sees a boy playing. But it's very deliberate, it's slow, there's no sound effects, it's overscored by this sort of ominous music. And you can always tell if something's not quite right if the music lets you know. And in this case it does. And I automatically thought, that must be their son. Logan Marshall-Greene's character and his ex-wife, who has met someone else, and you learn that fairly early on. But they don't really talk about their son. But I knew automatically, okay, just the way that this is presented, this must be their son. But as soon as they get inside, you don't see the child again. And I kept wondering, okay, was what he saw, was that a flashback? And it's interesting because as he goes throughout the house, and he hasn't been there in 2 years, and he's experiencing these almost like flashbacks as he goes through the house, and there will be times where he's standing in the present, and then from the same point of view, we'll be given a flashback where he's 2 years younger and he's with his current wife, and it's never, some things are never fully explained as well. The tragedy involving their son, all we know at the end is that he dies and that it was an accident involving another child, but you're never shown what it is. And a lot of things in this film are left to the viewer's imagination. And I really enjoyed that. I liked that. And the way that this movie gradually unfolded, but at the same time left a lot to the viewer's imagination, because with a psychological thriller such as this, your imagination is the strongest ingredient, because essentially you present a situation where, okay, here's what's right, here's about the situation, and then there's the uncanny. Here, let's present it in such a way so that there's something a little bit off. Now, it could be off, but we're not going to say either way if it is or not. We're going to imply, and then we're going to let your imagination run away with it. And this movie does a really good job, because I wasn't sure, ultimately, if everything was in Logan Marshall-Greene's head or not. His argument made a lot of sense, and he was constantly mistrusting and sort of misanthropic and whereas everyone else at the party was sort of friendly, and they were happy to be there, and they liked their hosts, and their hosts had nice wine, and they were very trusting. But at the same time, I had to stop and think, well, Logan Marshall-Greene is more familiar uh, with his hosts, and he has been through a really severe trauma. So if he wasn't a little bit mistrusting, if the evening wasn't uncomfortable, it would have felt out of place. So I understood his character and how he felt, but I also understood how the other characters felt and how they just wanted to come and try and make an evening of it. Now, as the film progresses, you start being shown things that make it feel like, okay, this isn't just a normal sort of get-together. There's something a little weird going on, something involving a cult. And they don't call it a cult right away, but one of the hosts, the man, shows them a video of somebody dying in a bed, and there's like a patriarch or an overseer who's explaining, oh, look at her, she's embracing emptiness. It's reunion, and it's a really strange video to show at a dinner party, and a lot of the characters say this, and they're like, well, why did you show us this? This is really, you feel uncomfortable. And at the same time, there are two characters at the party who aren't members of the regular group. They are friends of the host, but they are not friends of Logan Marshall-Greene or his friends or his new wife. And they show up, and you automatically kind of don't trust them because one of them is played by a particular actor, and I don't know his name off the top of my head, but he was in Zodiac. He's a bald guy, and he's a character actor who has a habit of playing suspicious suspects in murder films. So as soon as I saw him, I didn't trust him, and you know that the casting department picked him directly for that reason. They picked someone that you would recognize as sort of an unsavory or untrustworthy character. And he just has this weird sort of facial expression where he kind of drones, and like, it's kind of creepy. And to top it all off, his character during a game, it's called I Want, and they say what they want, and he says, I want to tell you about my wife. And as he talks about his wife, you learn that he killed her by accident. And as he's talking, you're not really sure because his story is so frank that it almost sounds like he killed her on purpose. And everyone, as you're listening, the camera focuses on his face, which, by the way, is very sort of deadpan and just kind of staring off into space. You know, it's told with a flat affect, which usually indicates a sort of trauma. A recollection of traumatic events is usually told with a flat affect, especially if the person is suffering some sort of psychological response. You know, the mind will protect itself by blocking certain things out, producing the flat affect or this non-existent emotional response. And he is telling this story very, I don't want to say nonchalantly, but just in this sort of indifferent manner at a dinner party during a game. And it's interesting because the camera focuses on him, and it gets closer and closer very slowly, and then when he's done telling the story, you see everyone's shocked faces. And this is a stranger at the party, for all intents and purposes, because he doesn't know the central protagonist. And you're like, wow, okay, this guy, he was creepy to begin with, but now he's really creepy. And one of the characters gets spooked, who happens to be a tenured professor, so she has more sense than anyone else just by virtue of the screenplay. She's the smart character. She's the anxious character. She's the Lambert of this movie. Like Lambert in Alien, where she gets spooked by the situation. She's the audience's reaction. And she says, I'm not comfortable with this. I want to go. And several of the characters are like, oh, the hosts are like, oh, you should stay. And then Logan Marshall-Greene's character says, why don't you let her go? You know, and he's kind of the corresponding voice of reason to this audience-like reaction from his professor friend, where he says, look, she's scared, she wants to go. And earlier in the film, there's a part where there are bars on the windows, and the doors all have locks, and the guy is the host is locking the door, and he takes the key out. He's like, "Why are you locking us in here?" Logan Marshall-Greene's character asks him. He says, "Why don't you just we're free to go whenever we want, right? Why not just leave the key in the lock?" And there's a lot of stuff like this where he's just sort of watching, and they don't say anything explicitly. It's the same principle that Quentin Tarantino used in his film, The Hateful Eight, where he says he has a scene that's presented ostensibly as normal, but there's just something not quite right about it. But the character who suspects that something is off, something is rotten in Denmark, just observes and watches, and he doesn't say anything right away, and you're sort of left in suspense, and it's very effective. And Logan Marshall-Greene's character is sort of that sleuth. He's the detective, despite the fact that he's presented as the emotionally damaged, sort of fragile character. He comes to the party and he's sort of disheveled, and he has a beard and long hair, and he kind of looks like the caddy that Happy Gilmore had, just kind of a hobo or a transient. But he's smarter than he looks, and something tells him in his gut that something is wrong, and you pick up on that as the movie progresses. But it doesn't shoot its shot right away. It takes its time, right up until the very end, practically. And I really love that, because you're not sure. You realize that these people are creepy. They're exhibiting cult-like tendencies, and you want to say, "You guys are fucking crazy." But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to make us drink Kool-Aid or shoot us. And it's interesting because you want to just point the finger at them, but at the same time, they're presented in such a way that you want to give them the benefit of the doubt. Now, I sort of picked up on a lot of these like little cues and subtle signs, because I have an interest in the Jonestown Massacre. I saw a documentary called Jonestown, The Life and Death of People's Temple. And it's a documentary essentially about the mass suicides in Brazil at Jonestown. And this movie kind of plays off that, but it wasn't like that remake. There was a remake film. It was by, oh shoot, I'm trying to remember the director's name off the top of my head, and I can't. He did House of the Devil, and he did a film about that, where it's very much note for note a rote copy of Jonestown. Whereas this is a psychological thriller that takes place in a small setting with a small party or group of people. It plays out in a very psychological manner, and it doesn't play out or spell out verbatim like that. That's essentially what's going on, but it does it in a much more subtle and psychological manner that makes you doubt more. Because when you watch the Jonestown remake, and I can't remember what it was called off the top of my head. I want to say it was called Sacrament, but it was a movie where there's no subtlety at all, and you automatically know that something is wrong because they're essentially going to Jonestown, and you know that off the bat. Whereas in this movie, it's Logan Marshall-Greene and his girlfriend going to a party. You know, it's ostensibly harmless. But as you learn more and more about your hosts, you see that underneath that cheerful demeanor, there is something sort of Jonestownsy about them. And it would have been a lot less effective if they were Jonestowny from the start and there was no persona or mask to hide that. But instead, it slowly reveals itself, and there's this mounting feeling of unease. And that's why you watch a movie like this, to feel that mounting feeling of suspense, of unease, and tension. And you're just waiting for something to happen, and you're not sure if it's going to or not, because despite the fact that Logan Marshall-Greene is going with his gut and his instinct, and the audience kind of sides with him automatically, there's a feeling that he might not be right just because of how the film is presented. And it presents several situations where Logan Marshall-Greene's character makes a declarative statement, says, "Look, something's not right here," and then it kind of blows up in his face, and then people are like, "Oh, well, he was wrong." uh, and and then he's upset and he's like, "I'm sorry, everyone," and then something else will happen to make him doubt that retraction or that apology and make him return to his original sentiment, which is his hosts are up to no good, essentially. So it's a very powerful film in that respect, but it's very effective. Uh, and eventually, what ends up happening is they are having a final toast. And at this point, Logan Marshall-Greene has just watched a video on a computer where the head of this cult is saying, "Do the final step, and then we will all be reunited." And he's like, "I love you all very much." And this guy's really creepy. And the message is implicit, not explicit. He doesn't say, "Kill them all." He says, "Do the final step." But the final step earlier in the film involved a woman dying and reuniting with everyone else in the cult, and they breathed in her spirit. It was all really wacky. And here, it's an instruction by the head of a cult, essentially, for his followers to take the final step. And you're left thinking, okay, this is really bizarre. And it reinstills that feeling of doubt that was initially um, diffused by Logan Marshall-Greene, Logan Marshall-Greene essentially being sort of debunked earlier in the film. So again, at first you're with him, then you're against him, and then you're like, well, wait a second. Towards the very end of the movie, and I was expecting something bad to happen. So I don't want to totally go side against him merely because, okay, the formula of this movie says that something's going to happen, but I'm not sure when in this particular case because the movie's really well made. And then that happens. And I'm like, oh, okay, suddenly I'm with Logan Marshall-Greene again. And then suddenly he's on board with his paranoia. And he's like, oh, well, I'm going to go out there and spoil their plans, basically. So they all sit around a table and they all have a toast. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is the Kool-Aid scene. Because they're all going to drink the Kool-Aid, basically. They're, in this case, fancy wine. And they're always going on about how fancy and lovely this wine is and how irresistible it is, so it's very seductive. And they're all about to drink it, and then he starts slapping the drinks out of their hands. One person drinks the wine. And then there's the two creepy people that are friends of the host, and they respond not in a good way to this. And one of them is the aforementioned bald guy who murdered his wife and went to prison for it. And the other one is essentially this sort of transient Manson girl type persona. Like, she's just really, there's something kind of trashy and unhinged about her, but she's a friend of Logan Marshall-Greene's character's ex-wife. But there's just something about her that seems kind of unstable and dangerous. And at this scene, she's like, "Oh, you ruined everything." And even then, you're not sure until you look at the person who drank the wine, who starts frothing at the mouth. And then you're like, "Oh, great, okay." Suddenly, you know that something really bad is going to happen because this means that Charlie was right. But even here, the movie doesn't just say, "Oh, look, Charlie was right. You're all wrong." Like, it unfolds, and they're trying to resuscitate the poison victim, and then things unfold in a violent fashion. But it doesn't happen automatically. There's a lot of confusion, and the characters don't all seem to understand. The only one who's really clear on what's going on is Charlie, and he's full of paranoia and suspicion, so even he's not 100% sure. But what proves that he was right is the poisoning. And then after that, once the cat is out of the bag, things essentially go to hell in a handbasket. And at this point, the movie's almost over. So the rest of the film is essentially dedicated to characters being killed, essentially. And it happens in relatively short and brutal fashion, as I expected would in that case, because it turns out the bald guy that murdered his wife doesn't feel guilt about that, and he doesn't feel guilt about murdering party guests that refuse to drink the poison Kool-Aid. well, if they don't do that, we still need them to go to paradise. So I'm going to send them to paradise by either stabbing them to death or shooting them with this 38. And it's kind of creepy, you know, because um, the rest of the film is essentially Logan Marshall-Greene and his wife running away and hiding, and they hide. Again, they're not necessarily being chased. The movie gets really quiet, and you get to listen as everyone else in the house is murdered while they hide, and the camera just kind of focuses on them, and it feels really claustrophobic, and it's just kind of uncomfortable, you know, because it doesn't focus. It's not, okay, different points of view as we get to a front row seat to these people being killed. You hear it in the distance. You see it as Logan Marshall-Greene looks through a glass door and sees his friend stabbed to death with a knife. It's all from their perspective, and most of their perspective is in a dark room. So the movie still somehow keeps you in suspense to some extent, despite the fact that the cat is out of the bag. And essentially what ends up happening at the end is just about everyone in the movie dies, except for Logan Marshall-Greene and his wife. They're essentially the final boy and the final girl of this psychological thriller. But there's a nice little twist at the end. Two nice twists. The movie starts with them driving towards the party, and what ends up happening is they hit a coyote, and Logan Marshall-Greene has to euthanize said coyote with a tire iron. At the end of the film, his ex-wife is bleeding. She had just shot herself, and she confesses that she wasn't 100% on board with this cult ideology, and she wanted to leave, and she grieved for the loss of their son. And it's kind of, you feel a twinge of remorse for this character, despite the fact that she's really unlikable for most of it. You understand what she's going through, and you end up sort of, at least, empathizing. And you're like, oh, you know, that's, she's not as monstrous as we would have thought. Her husband was terrible, and the two cronies were awful and obviously just delusional psychopaths. But she ends with a note of dignity, and he picks her up, he scoops her up in his arms, and carries her out into the lawn. And she's bleeding to death, and he's holding in his hand a fire poker. And I said, oh, what a nice parallel here, because earlier at the beginning of the movie, he euthanizes the coyote or the wolf, and here he's going to euthanize his wife with a fire poker. He doesn't do that, but there was still a visual parallel, because she dies of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the abdomen, and euthanizing her isn't necessary. But at the same time, I like that parallel, and he ultimately, you know, it's an empathetic scene. You feel for this character, the remorse, and it makes the scene more tragic in that respect. Whereas when the husband dies, he dies with this maddened look on his face, and he has a knife sticking out of his chest, and he's just crazy. He's just flat nuts, and you can't identify with him at all, and you're like, good riddance, fucker. Or when the bald thug is killed, he's essentially screaming like an animal, or almost like an oversized baby, as Logan Marshall-Greene's girlfriend smashes his head in with a vase. And again, you don't feel for him at all. He's just this brute. And his crazy girlfriend dies on the couch bleeding to death. She's totally nuts. And it's just, you don't feel for those characters at all. But the reoccurring drama that occurs between Logan Marshall-Greene and his ex-wife comes full circle, and you end up feeling empathy for that, remorse, and it feels meaningful in that respect. So she's, in the end, this flawed woman is redeemed. You know, so that's to the film's benefit. You know, it's a nice way to sort of end it. But there's a twist, because of course it's kind of a horror at heart. Right before the dinner party massacre, the husband lights a lantern, a red lantern, and it's out next to a cliff face. Essentially, it's on the edge of a cliff. And you're like, oh, okay. Are they going to go outside and maybe, I don't know, sing some songs or hold hands? And next to this lantern, but it's very small. It's almost like a signal fire. But I didn't really think anything of it until they're standing out on the lawn, and Logan Marshall-Greene's ex-wife has just passed on, and you see that lantern burning. And then they all, the husband, or Logan Marshall-Greene and his girlfriend, holding hands, walk out, or they walk out to the cliff face, and the camera is looking at their faces. So we don't see what they see, but they go, oh my God. And you start hearing noises in the background of gunshots and people screaming in the distance. And then we get a point of view shot of what they're looking at. And you see all of these red lanterns in the background. And you're like, wow, okay, so this is happening everywhere else. And again, this allows the viewer's imagination to sort of run wild and say, oh my God, if this happened here and after what we just saw and how horrible it was, it's happening all over the place. And it was a nice way to end the movie. So ultimately, I know some people didn't like Prometheus. They think, okay, Logan Marshall-Greene is a lesser Tom Hardy. Well, this is a really great film, and it really played to his strengths. And I haven't seen very many films with him, just Prometheus and then this movie, The Invitation. But here he was great. You know, he really carried the film, and at times I felt like I was giving him a bit of a hard time because his performance was very similar to Prometheus's Charlie. And I thought, okay, it's Charlie from Prometheus at a dinner party. But here it didn't feel out of place. In Prometheus, I thought he was miscast. I thought his performance, it felt like it belonged in a drama, but Prometheus was supposed to be a space epic. So his character felt out of place. He did a good performance with the character, but ultimately, Charlie as a character was incongruous to that film. Whereas here, he was totally appropriate, and he did a fine job, and I had nothing to complain about. And I kind of wish there were more movies like this that he starred in, because he's not a bad actor. Ultimately, you know, people say, "Oh, Tom Hardy's better." Well, okay, but they're two different actors, and they don't really. Yeah, they look a little bit alike, but they're different. And in this film, Logan Marshall-Greene proves, hey, I'm just as good an actor as this other guy. And I like Tom Hardy, but I also like Logan Marshall-Greene. And I don't, after watching this movie, yeah, I totally have faith in the guy. It's a good film. I really liked it. It's a slow burn, obviously. It's an independent movie, so it doesn't adhere to mainstream sort of slasher-like tropes. With a movie like this, you know, a mainstream movie would have just fired its shot much earlier, and we would have been left with a meandering middle act and a final act that felt kind of drawn out and pointless. Here, it takes its time, and it's much more effective as a result. If I had to rate this movie numerically, I'd give it something like, you know, maybe a 92 or a 93 out of 100. You know, it's a solid A. It's a good movie. And it's a type of film that doesn't necessarily get made nowadays. The thriller, in its best, most effective form, takes too long and requires a longer attention span than I think modern audiences are used to with mainstream cinema. So yeah, definitely this is a great film. You guys definitely, if you're fans of psychological thrillers that are effective and make you think and use your imagination, then this is par excellence. This is a thriller par excellence. It's really a solid film, and you should go see it. So yeah.